Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking to Justin Beals, who is the founder and CEO of StrikeGraph. We've had Justin on before, and we talked a lot about what StrikeGraph does. We're going to kind of recap what StrikeGraph does and what it's been up to in the last 6 months. We're also going to talk about the kind of broader compliance, regulatory, and security requirements and how they're evolving given just the industry in general, but also given some of the current macroeconomic trends. Before we get into all that, though, let's say hi to Justin. Justin, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Mark. It's a pleasure to join you again. Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, are you still up in the Skagit Valley area up there?
Yeah, it's pumpkin harvesting season. I think they had a couple championship pumpkins.
All right.
It's very relaxing to watch a whole different industry go through its cycle, especially agriculture like that. And of course, we're known for our tulips, and so they're putting the tulip bulbs in the ground right now.
I was just going to say you have a couple different agricultural kind of industries and also kind of touristic events that kind of revolve around that. And the tulips and daffodils and all that is an amazing time of the year to visit that whole area.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful.
Are you getting hit by the smoke right now from the forest fires?
A little bit. I think we're right on the cusp. I think Seattle's had it much worse. We're kind of equidistant between Vancouver, BC, and Seattle, Washington, and certainly it's been a longer summer than we're used to. And so Seattle people or Pacific Northwesters rarely look forward to rain, but I think they're starting to look forward.
Right now, we're just praying for it. And it's funny, I just looked at the weather forecast and it's like nothing but, yellow balls for the next, like 7 to 8 days. And we need the rain, especially over in Eastern Washington. But well, hey, just for the benefit of for me and our listeners and anybody that didn't hear you when you were on here before, could you just give us an overview of what StrikeGraph does and and how you're positioned versus the competition?
Sure. StrikeGraph helps our customers achieve critical security certifications that are sales assets in the marketplace. The most typical security certification that our customers try to achieve is SOC 2. But we also support standards such as PCI DSS, HIPAA, ISO 27001. There's a list of them. I think we'll actually talk a little bit more about some of the standards and what we see happening about that later in the conversation. What's really important to understand about StrikeGraph is, and I'll try to encapsulate it, we don't believe that any one kind of security in a box tool really works for any one customer. The 80-20 rule is not a great fit for deciding a good security posture. And so what's really valuable about StrikeGraph is we provide, our solution provides security orchestration from the perspective of on our platform, you can really efficiently, in just a couple of hours, scope a security posture that fits your business exactly, identify the evidence that needs to be gathered, automate the collection of that evidence, and also distribute the ownership of that security posture across your team so that those that are responsible for HR security or those that are responsible for DevOps security have that responsibility. Now, the second part of StrikeGraph that's really critical is the measurement side. When we say measurement, we are talking about independent audits and assessments that StrikeGraph is able to provide to help a customer kind of show that company maturity in a sales motion and close deals.
It's interesting. I don't know if you used the term sales assets before the last time we spoke, but it's interesting because clearly most organizations view security as something that in terms of they have to protect their own digital assets, right? And at I guess at the core of that is security is also an expense, okay? Because it's a cost center in itself of just our own organizational requirements. You're looking at your customers' customers' requirements, if I get that right. And in order for your customers to get more customers or to keep their customers, they need to demonstrate a certain baseline or a certain level of security. And I'll let you kind of fill that in. But if they can do that, then all of a sudden that becomes an asset. So security in that sense is something that you can actually probably calculate some type of ROI on.
Yeah. This has been a 5-year massive shift in the way security implementation is perceived at organizations of all different sizes. I remember the days when I was a security engineer at British Telecom, where the quote was, if you didn't get hacked, you spent enough, and if you did get hacked, then you haven't spent enough, right? And it was a liability measurement more than anything. Today, what we're seeing is, if you want to participate in the B2B marketplace and part of your solution requires the sharing of data, buyers don't want to buy your solution unless there is some independent verification of your security practices. That is measurement, that's SOC 2, that's ISO 27001, and the buyers are driving the shift in perception. I think it's a fair question to ask why. And the statistic that's really interesting, and the reason this has all changed, is that about 70% of data breaches are coming from third-party vendors. So if you're a CISO at an organization and you want to really reduce the opportunity for a data breach, probably the number one lever you can pull is to ask your vendors to meet independently assessed security requirements.
Makes a lot of sense. And apologies, I just had my phone go off there. Normally I would have shut that off, but anyway, keeps me on my toes. So, I want to dig into that because the organization that I primarily work for, MemoQ, they are a translation management service provider. It's a software tool, and they both have on-prem and cloud-based deployments. And we, especially when we're involved in RFP processes, there are questions around our security controls, both in terms of our product, but then also in terms of our company, right? And oftentimes, increasingly, we are seeing the question: are you SOC 2 certified? Okay. And so let's kind of start at the beginning there. In terms of those questions around our security controls based upon either our product, which is our software, or our company, how does StrikeGraph help with that?
Yeah, the first thing that StrikeGraph helps with is we help companies scope the right security posture for their business. And there's two ways to go about it in our platform. We can drive it around a standard, like you're getting RFPs, direct customer requests for you to have a SOC 2 audit accomplished and have that SOC 2 report that you can share with buyers. So you may drive decisions, high level. How does StrikeGraph help me get the right security posture? Well, I want it to be SOC 2 compliant, and that's kind of where my premise starts. And we look through a very large control database that we have so that you have a good set of controls that matches your business and the SOC 2 requirements. Now, earlier stage businesses oftentimes don't know what the best security posture is, and we have a really nice, very efficient risk assessment that is kind of a lens for like what risks is my organization confronted with, and what's the best controls to implement to mitigate that risk. And so we essentially suggest up the controls based upon a risk that would make the most sense for your organization. But the real difference there is that we're trying our best to eliminate security theater. Too often, if you're like, this happened to me, I was like, oh, I need to implement some good security at my company when I was a chief technology officer. And I said, oh, the quick question is like, what's the right set of policies? And so I get a templated list of policies and go fill them out. But when I got done, I was like, half of these don't apply to us. They're just not the way we're doing business. They're not our type of product. They don't make sense. And I think this is our criticism of some of the other competitors in the marketplace, is that they take every company and they fit them in the same box. And that's just not the way good security works. That's not the way efficient security happens. And that's also not the best way to get through some of these compliance requirements, because you wind up doing things that aren't really effective and missing the ones that were important security for your business.
Well, what I've seen is, again, from where I sit, both in terms of the company that I primarily work with now, but also from my experience with other organizations, is there is, when you're selling to a company and they send you this security questionnaire or RFI or RFP document, there's this temptation or kind of sense of urgency that we have to say yes to everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that can be problematic because, in some industries, so for example, our specific industry, none of our competitors are SOC 2 certified. They will issue statements saying that the majority of our controls are aligned with SOC 2 best practices, things like that. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna table that for a second, but go back to the whole sense of urgency and this desire to answer in the affirmative to all the questions. What are your thoughts in terms of best practices in from the business point of view? How do you handle those kind of questionnaires?
Well, you don't have to answer affirmatively to all those questions in the questionnaire if what you do isn't a risk. So, for example, let's say that the service you provide doesn't really retain the data for a long period of time. It's more like maybe it's a AI-based transcription service, and once the reports are handed back off, you're not having to maintain that data for quite a bit of time. There are certain questions about data retention that, again, how do you answer affirmatively? What they might want to hear is that you're letting that data go quite quickly. You're not retaining the information. Whereas like StrikeGraph, data retention is really critical to our customers. And so we would have to answer that question in an affirmative way that says we can retain data as long as the customer needs. This is kind of our process, and it's well thought out and kind of battle tested. We run it through a quality assurance process on a regular basis. So I think you should think more about, in answering these security questionnaires, what is the right controls for my business? I certainly want to represent those in the questionnaire. But then where there's a question that doesn't fit for the type of relationship we're going to have, just highlight that and explain it. In StrikeGraph, what we did is we built an AI tool for this. Security questionnaires for us are a measurement issue. Like a buyer, I'm trying to measure your security practices.
Right.
And what our platform will do is we'll break down all the questions in the questionnaire, and then we use natural language processing to go find the controls that you're operating. So we give you a cheat sheet, when you're answering the questionnaire that essentially says, well, if you're asking me about my hiring practices and making sure that I have the right talent, here are the controls that I operate inside my organization that would answer that question. And so that gives you a place of confidence, right, to respond to the RFP.
Do you do anything like take a look at, for example, all the security questionnaires, RFPs, et cetera, that a company has received over the previous, whatever time period it is, let's just say 6 months or a year, and say, based upon what your customers are asking or requiring, we recommend that you pursue this type of certification or this type of security posture, et cetera?
Not today, but that's a great one for our roadmap.
Okay.
I think definitely people have real line of sight on what their customers are asking for. And, and
well, let me just cut in for a second, because if we go to the SOC 2 thing, when you talk to salespeople in this organization that I'm referring to, it's like SOC 2 is we got to have it. But when you drill down and you look, that none of the competitors actually have it, so then it becomes like, how do we explain what are they looking for from SOC 2, and can we meet their requirements? Because maybe they might not need every single criteria to achieve that certification. Plus, it's a time-consuming and expensive process, right? But if you listen to the business people on the business side, they're like, "Oh my God, we got to have it! And if we could have it, I'd hit my quota for sure." So,
yeah.
So
that's definitely how I got introduced to the problem. Salespeople are like, "Justin, we need to get SOC 2," and I'm like, "Do I have to? Oh my goodness!"
There goes 2 years and $80,000 or whatever.
Yeah. I think that well, some of the calculus has broadly changed, but let me pose the problem in a slightly different way, and I think it
Please.
may help endear the process to you a little more. So there was a study done on why companies did SOC 2, and 90% of them said that it was for a competitive advantage or to compete in the marketplace. When we broke that down further, that 90% that said that's why they got SOC 2, it was for two equal reasons. So half of that said they needed to keep up with a market that was already ahead of them from a security compliance perspective. Half of them were doing it to edge out their competitors. So if they had done it and the others hadn't, it is still a hugely beneficial sales asset.
Sure.
Because if you're going through a buying proposition and the question on the buyer side in procurement is like, well, this company isn't as secure as this company, that's just not a risk people like to take at all, even for lesser feature set.
Yeah, and it's interesting because just because you're SOC 2, certified, doesn't mean that doesn't guarantee that you're any more secure than your direct competitor who may not be certified. But if we get into the psychology and processes of the buying organizations, again, they need to check their box and they need to say, from where I sit, this company doesn't raise any flags, but this company over here who's not SOC 2, I can't go any deeper. I just know that what they're telling me. So from where I sit, this company has SOC 2 certification. No flags. These ones don't. Some flags pop up. And from a sales point of view, you just don't want people to raise flags. You want people to be like, okay, yeah. Right? So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. You can take the buyer persona a little bit and be like, where do they want to like spend political capital? I almost guarantee you it's not on being like, well, I made a custom decision about the security posture of these different. That's just not where they want to. Like,
they seem like nice people.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also say that another part of the thing that's shifted here is StrikeGraph especially has dramatically lowered the cost of getting through a SOC 2 audit process. I remember the days where it was an $80,000 engagement. Typically at StrikeGraph, to even get the audit and everything required accomplished, we're really talking about a $20K to $25K contract, or a budget. So that has dramatically shifted, and a lot of that has to do with the technology we put in place. That
I might have a prospective customer for you, so we'll.
Yeah. And because it's a sales asset, it's been, I think as an ex-CTO, that was my job before founding StrikeGraph. Having that it's like a reusable currency, the SOC 2 audit.
Sure.
The auditors won't call it a certificate, but for our audience, it works equally well. I'm absolutely fine. But that SOC 2 certificate, it's like I can reuse that trust asset over and over and over again for every single deal. Sure. And it is a very efficient way to express that larger company maturity.
Okay. Well, I would say we've been talking about SOC 2 kind of from the outside, or we've been touching on it for the last few minutes here. In terms of the other types of certifications, I think in our last conversation you mentioned that ISO 27001 was actually probably more comprehensive and appropriate for a lot of companies in the market. But what are you seeing? Are there any big developments in terms of preferences for certain types of certifications or changes in the certifications themselves in terms of the requirements to achieve them?
Yeah, so the ISO governing body updated their 27001 standard just recently. We've actually incorporated all the new updates into the StrikeGraph platform. And I think some of the changes were kind of letting go of some legacy things, like there used to be a ISO requirement around server timing and network timing, like how do you run your clocks for network timing? things like that have kind of gone away a little bit as we rely on cloud providers like AWS. That's all infrastructure in a way that we don't have to think about, like I did when I used to work at a place like British Telecom, where network timing was critical to operations. Also, we've seen teams broaden requirements around privacy. And actually, ISO released a new standard, the ISO 27701 standard, and it is focused on privacy specifically. And it's a great umbrella privacy standard because if you solve for that one, you'll also solve for GDPR, you'll also solve for California consumer privacy. So it's kind of a nice thing on the privacy side. I want to highlight that privacy is not really often a cybersecurity standard. Mm-hmm. It's more about a process and management standard. So how can one of your customers ask for data deletion, especially if you're like a social network or something like that, or sure, a copy of their data? These are the types of requirements that have come up in GDPR. I did read recently that the US and the EU are getting closer to an agreed upon data sharing requirements. I think that the federal government has agreed to put together essentially a court of inquiry mm-hmm. for requests on data. And that was one of the things that basically had US companies had to comply with GDPR and had to host EU data only in the EU. Like, we couldn't use our servers in the US to host EU data. And so it's good to see the US and the EU start to work towards common understandings and the ability to move data back and forth between the two geographies. One thing that's been interesting for us is that we've seen SOC 2 is like definitely the gateway drug for this, right? Like it's the Swiss Army knife of security standards. It's very accepted, especially in the United States. The audit process and certification process is not as heavy-handed as ISO, and so it can be easier and less expensive to accomplish. But we are seeing a lot of organizations that weren't really in the health tech space having to tack on HIPAA mm-hmm. to their SOC 2 and do both. And the reason is that maybe they had a technology product and they started out in a vertical market like fintech. But then they started getting requests from healthcare organizations to utilize that product as well. And now they're storing patient healthcare information. Now all of a sudden they have to be HIPAA compliant. And the HIPAA law doesn't state a certification process for HIPAA. But one of the things that has been being asked by buyers is quote unquote HIPAA certification. And so one of the true innovations at StrikeCraft that we've been delivering is we'll run a HIPAA audit for our customers and provide that certification for them. And so that's very powerful because sure. we love that sales asset, right? Like you need something, piece of paper from an independent assessor to hand over to a buyer that they can use to trust you.
Yeah, I mean, so we have an RFP team, and what we do is we have a database of all RFP questions that we've been asked before. I wouldn't say all, but the lion's share, and the answers that have been submitted. And when we get a document, we pre-populate the document based upon previously submitted responses. But then, of course, we update because things change. Whenever there's something like that, a new requirement that we have, then everybody's running and like, how can we go do this? And it would be super cool to have a tool that'd be just like, or a platform and say like, well, you know what, we need to tack on HIPAA compliance here or HIPAA audit here. And how do we do that? And if it's just built into the platform, instead of going out and finding an independent agency to walk us through that process, and guaranteed, and I'm not trying to sell for you here, but I guarantee that if we just go find an independent agency that we're not already doing business with, most likely it's going to take more time and money than if you already are, have a kind of understanding of our security posture and where we're at. So now I might be reading too much into it, but I'm just thinking that's probably makes sense.
No, you're exactly right. And I drew inspiration from time I spent in the education technology space for how we think about standards and standards management. I don't know if you know this, but between like 2000 and 2010 in education, we basically drove towards a standards-based education process. So
Hmm.
if anyone has children, you know that they take standardized tests on a standard of what they
Yep.
should know by which grade. And I can tell you every hour in the classroom, every question they answer on a quiz, that's all aligned and mapped onto the standard. And what happens is that you might be teaching, double digit division. And if you have a product that teaches that, you know that all the standards out there, and each state has a unique set, that maps somewhere on each standard. Same thing is happening for us in security here. If you have a control to encrypt data on the wire, so you're going to force HTTPS, I know that that control contributes to SOC 2 and ISO 27001 and HIPAA, and PCI DSS. And so when you utilize StrikeGraph, our controls are pre-mapped to every standard already. So let's say you get SOC 2, and then you come back to us and you say, and this is very common, a company will say, hey, we got this opportunity with a healthcare provider, and we'd really like to get it. How far away are we from HIPAA? And we can give them, hey, you're 20 controls away from HIPAA. You're really close. You're not that far off. There's just a little bit of gap here to go and fill in.
While you're talking, my sales hat and light bulb popped on, and if I was using StrikeGraph and running a sales team, I would be into to your office or whoever's managing StrikeGraph internally for us and say, all right, okay, so what are the low-hanging fruit that we've already qualified, and I don't care what state, privacy requirement or industry requirement, how obscure it is, I don't care. Let's just get it and add it to our list. Because if we, and again, I mean, being part of the sales process, I'd be like, oh my gosh, look at all these certifications they've achieved, right? And
Yeah.
so, and you can do that because that's what the tool allows for.
Look at what standards have unlocked for you in a way, right? Like we've
Right.
seen this in software development where standards-based software development or using a common framework allows us to bring in developers faster, to grow the architecture more quickly with a feature set because we're all working from kind of a common situation. Now you're not looking at standards as a net drain on my business,
Mm-mm.
but essentially my ability to market and build sales opportunity off of security maturity. We didn't have that opportunity in the past, right? Like
No.
security was a cost center. Now it's part of the revenue equation. I think that's great. Like I think
Yeah.
that's a better marketplace.
Totally. And I want to talk about that marketplace because I think in our last conversation you referenced the size of the marketplace, but I'll come back to that in a second. Before we get into the size of the marketplace and the growth trajectory, I'm just curious, and I'm just throwing this out there. Another one of the requirements that we get are ESG kind of requirements. And do you map into any of those, support any of those kind of requests?
We have not rolled out an ESG standard on the platform directly. We do get requests for them. And one of the nice things about StrikeGraph is, we have an enterprise governance, risk, and compliance solution kind of at the base software. And so customers can really easily add new controls that might be towards an ESG outcome that they're working towards. Like we do really good for process-oriented controls, setting-oriented controls. So for example, we've been piloting SOC 1 audits lately, which are often process controls for fintech. Like if you're a
Right.
payroll processor, what is the process that you ensure that payroll was processed effectively? And so we're definitely seeing some customers kind of, hey, I all of a sudden realize that what StrikeGraph is doing from a security orchestration perspective is helping me orchestrate what controls I need, who owns them, and am I validating them from an evidence perspective? And whether that control is about, consumption from an ESG perspective or encryption from a cybersecurity perspective, it doesn't really matter. It all gets housed in the same system.
Yeah, it's interesting because the security questions kind of overlap with, in our experience, with some of the data privacy protection compliance, and then when you have compliance, then you get in things like the ESG. You also have the was it diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of questions, which we're seeing as an increasingly common. Even though that sometimes that there could be a standard, maybe there's not. They're just asking, do you have policies in place, this kind of thing. But we're seeing that as kind of increasingly common. And I guess if you have policy someplace, I'm just trying to think through this. If you would be able to just kind of map that in, because you have your policy set, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. So
okay.
let's say you're getting asked about DEI initiative, and so you might say, hey, we need to design some controls around this so that we can monitor our DEI initiative. One of the controls around DEI might be we need a control that states that we will collect data on our diversity hiring practices. And the owner of that would probably be your VP of HR. Yeah. And then the evidence requirement to validate that the control was operated is an annual report on diversity hiring. And so now that lives in the StrikeGraph system, and they have ownership over that. And maybe they're storing it on Google Drive or Office 365, that data set. And they can even integrate StrikeGraph into that system, and we can pull that data automatically for them on a regular basis.
Awesome. Let's go back. You touched on the size of the industry, and I'm just looking at my notes here. I think that you mentioned during our last conversation that the market for I probably am not getting this right, for audits and security. No, I think it was audits, and I'm not reading it right. Audit. Can you help me out? It would
I'm happy to. Yeah, I know this one well. In 2019, the global marketplace for non-financial audits and audit services was $100 billion. Yeah.
There you go. And you predicted that by 2028, I think it would go up to like 300 billion, which is that still what you're seeing?
That's exactly what we're seeing. And the data on that is that number for non-financial audits and audit services have been growing at a 10 to 15% year over year for the decade before 2019. And there was nothing to dissuade us from seeing that continue to grow similarly. And so what's going on here is that, we had these financial audit processes. This was a measurement of, the financial transparency in an organization and that the books aligned up with the bank records. Now, there's centuries of banking technology that makes that really easy. Simple innovations like a ledger help us align that data right at the end of the day. But this kind of non-financial audits, the security audits we do, the ESG audits we do, the process controls, there's not centuries worth of innovation around it. And so one is that that 100 billion, where was that money going in 2019? I can tell you that probably 90% of it was going to consultants. You can think about like the big 4 audit firms. You mentioned like a while ago it was $80K to get a SOC 2. That's because you were spending 2/3 of that $80K on like prep with the auditor and things like a pre-test before we did the actual audit. And it was just a huge consulting space. And so really one way to look at StrikeGraph and why we've grown so quickly is that we have chewed into that consulting space with code and solution and automation that has dramatically reduced the price of total ownership of a SOC 2 compliant security practice.
Pretty exciting. So I'm just curious how the current, macroeconomic situation has affected that growth trajectory.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was struck with when I was a CTO and trying to deal with this was this idea that security was all of a sudden a sales asset. It really floored me to imagine that I had to change my entire perspective around how we engaged around security. And I think that even in a macroeconomic environment where we're on the verge of or could possibly be in kind of a recession in the United States here, what we are seeing is a ever increasing desire to achieve these because it is a sales asset. And not only that, it's like a renewal asset. So once you gain a customer and they looked at that SOC 2 when they signed the first contract, they expect you to have your annual audit accomplished every year. And
Sure.
if you don't, they're really going to wonder what the trajectory of your company is like. And so we continue to grow quite quickly. We continue to see a lot of upgrade, on StrikeGraph. And we like to align our upsell motion with like a real value for the customer. So it's more around, hey, I started with SOC 2 and I want to add HIPAA. We think that's a value because you're having a new sales asset in the marketplace. So I think that it's always easier to earn new revenue than cut dollars, at a
Sure.
business. And so if StrikeGraph is critical to retaining or earning new dollars, then we see continued renewed interest in, our solution and solving that sales problem.
Well, and I would imagine that, most organizations, as we head into this recession that's not a recession, that is a recession, that they're looking to cut costs where they can. And if they are still using the traditional model of trying to achieve these different certifications, and they're dealing with the big consulting firms, I would assume that you're in a much more competitive space because your scalability and your cost structure would seem to be much more attractive.
Yes, and I think there's a general dissatisfaction with the consultative approach with audit firms and certification firms. The criticism we hear is that they can be capricious, and I use that word to describe a situation where we've seen situations where a customer was going into an audit with an audit firm, and depending on the individual they worked with, they would get dramatically different requests for meeting the standard. That was a real struggle for us.
Sure.
We couldn't understand why they couldn't get lined up on what they expected as a firm, let alone firm to firm to firm, how different things are. And customers are when they're looking for a standard, they're looking for a sense of deep, like, this is what I have to do. And StrikeGraph brings that to bear for our customers. And so part of our solution these days is that we've really worked hard so that the CPAs that we work with are have a deep understanding about how to audit technology, which they are not deep experts in. Sure. and can line that up so the expectations are met. We want an ethical audit, but we also don't want the capriciousness to happen. And I think generally as a trend, the other thing that's been absolutely interesting to me is when I first looked as a CTO at getting a SOC 2 audit, I talked to a lot of auditors that were like, oh, don't go get the audit from that firm. They're not as well respected. And it's really important to have the right logo on your audit. We then, in researching StrikeGraph, we went and interviewed a bunch of buyers and we said, does it matter if it's, EY or PwC or a mid-market, on your SOC 2 audit? And none of them cared. Right. And so I think that they want the buyer wants an independent assessment. They want it done ethically and they want it done well, but they don't care what the logo is on the top. And I'll give you my favorite example of that. Go download AWS's SOC 2 audit. You won't find a single CPA firm logo anywhere on that document. You get to
I thought you were going to tell me it was StrikeGraph, but
no, not yet. We're
not yet.
On
okay.
That. Yeah. But I think the idea here that you need an independent assessment, but does the logo really matter on it? It's just not playing out to be true.
From where I sit, and I probably see, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 RFP documents I mean, it's I would say every 2 weeks, okay? And I've never seen one that said who was your certifying organization for this particular, certification. Um, just a couple more questions here. Earlier you mentioned like when you upsell or you see upsell opportunities to or with your customers. Well, what does that mean? So like, so maybe you can explain a little bit about your price structure or how you charge, and then what an upsell would be.
Sure. So we understand that this is a real journey for organizations. And so we've designed the StrikeGraph platform to very early stage startups can begin to use it for helping sales and implementing security, and then very mature organizations with multiple standards that they'd like to meet can use it to be successful there as well. And the way that journey looks is a little like this. If you're a super early stage startup, let's say you're 3 to 5 employees, you may be getting ready to launch a pilot product. You don't need to get SOC 2 yet, but you do need to show some maturity around how you're storing the data. You can use our StrikeGraph Essentials platform to get a basic control list in place, get the evidence for that control list, and be able to provide a report right out of StrikeGraph that says, hey, I'm meeting these security requirements. And I think from a pricing perspective, we have some special offers for startups, but you're probably in the 5 to 10K range per year with us, depending on where you want to begin. The next thing we tip.
I mean, you could spend that much easily on a one and done kind of pen test. So that's right. Sounds reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what we see people quickly migrate to is they get a production software in the marketplace. They're probably at 15 to 25 employees at that point, and they need to get that first audit accomplished, that first independent assessment. Now that they are, selling their retail price in the market and expecting that data share, and they want to really begin the scaling motion of their business. So for us, I think all in on a SOC 2 certification, and we wrap into that the penetration test. We look at about 20K per year to get that SOC 2 audit accomplished. And that's
now
really
when you say that, does that include there would be some external cost on top of that, or like you got to deal with somebody who's actually going to come in and do the certification, right?
We have a deal with someone that's coming in to do the certification.
So
that is all in. Yeah,
that's all in.
Yeah.
That's I'm not here to sell your services, man, but I having been in the marketplace myself for a while, I'd say it's a pretty compelling offer.
Yeah, and certainly I think for those that are interested, we're happy to explain how it happens, but a lot of it comes down to having great data, well organized from our customers, and a lot of very powerful tooling around technology testing. It's a very powerful way for us to deliver that certification. And there's not a lot of other options in the marketplace compared to StrikeGraph and how we do that. And it's grown the business immensely in the last year. Okay. Now, what happens next is that you're like, great, I have SOC 2, I'm selling it, it's working, and then a new sales issue comes up around HIPAA. Or let's say you're PCI DSS, you're a fintech company, you got SOC 2, but you're getting close to 1 million transactions. And so a PCI DSS tier 1, tier 2 is starting to come into play for you. And then the customer comes back and upgrades with us. And we'll see that over 3 to 5 years. They will typically wind up between 2 to 3, maybe up to 4 different standards that they're trying to meet with a security posture on StrikeGraph. And we're helping them through those certification processes as well. Depending on the standard, we can do the assessment work like HIPAA. We have certified information systems auditors on staff, and so they can perform a certification. But things like ISO 27001 are a little more complicated. They require 2 independent bodies, StrikeGraph and another certifying body, to work together to get through that particular process. So we manage carefully with our customers expectations around costs, not only the cost for StrikeGraph, but the costs they might be paying to third parties.
Excellent. Makes a lot of sense, and like I said, it's a pretty darn compelling offer. Well, hey, last thing here, we've chewed up almost an hour, and really enjoying the conversation. But any things in the pipeline over the next 3-6 months that you'd like to talk about?
Well, we just launched CMMC on our platform with NIST 800-171. That's great for Department of Defense work. Okay. I think on our roadmap is FedRAMP as well. We also just launched a more detailed GDPR solution on our platform. We continue to see a lot of growth in the small to mid-market companies adopting StrikeGraph. And what we're finding very organically is how powerful the solution is for even more mature organizations, up to, I would say, 5,000 plus employees. Intriguingly, one thing that I think your audience may find interesting, what we're seeing at the enterprise, the upper enterprise issue of compliance is a real shift as well. It used to be that the CISO would do like an Archer RSA adoption, and they would kind of manage throughout the organization compliance on the whole. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing at that 5,000 plus employees is that now different divisions inside of an organization, because they have revenue responsibility, are charting their own compliance journey and operating their own controls. And so that's been really interesting to us to work with some really big companies, but on a division by division basis. And so I think for those, executives that might be running a division with P&L responsibility to the corporate, they might be saying, hey, maybe something like StrikeGraph is a solution for us, because I don't want to continue to wait for a corporate to reach a compliance outcome that is impacting sales for me today.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, hey, Justin, again, totally enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure, what's the word? Very happy for your growth trajectory and the way things continue to develop for you. Would like to wish you the best for the remainder of 2022.
Thanks, Mark. Always a pleasure to join the conversation with you.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.